Hi there, and thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our podcast and have a recommendation about someone you think that we should have on to share their voice and journey with the world, by all means, let us know. It could be an aid worker, monastic, author, journalist, doctor, resistance leader, really anyone with some tie or another to the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To offer up a name, go to our website, insightmyanmar.org, and let us know. But for now, just sit back and take a listen to today's podcast. We welcome Brian Hioe to this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, and we're going to hear about his life of student activism in Taiwan, the many connections, perhaps surprising to some listeners, that association in Taiwan had with Burma, both today in contemporary times, as well as going back generations, and then how his involvement as a student activist led into the Milk Tea Alliance, of which Burma is playing a very important role now with the crisis that's been developing and the role of the milk tea activists.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so actually a great deal of my life was actually spent in the U.S. I spent around 20 years in the U.S. Of course, of growing up. A lot of my early childhood was back and forth, U.S. and Taiwan, but I was mostly in the U.S. And so that's how Myanmar issues came on my radar. In high school, I was the president of a human rights club, which is a very kind of new, young, fresh to activist person doing these kind of different activities. But that was a country of concern, particularly I think for the international human rights discourse at that point in time. So I was aware of issues going back to high school, which is 2006 to 2009. And later on, I ended up in various other movements like Occupy Wall Street in New York in 2011, and Japan in the anti-nuclear movement of 2012, and then in the Sunflower movement in 2014, which is where a lot of my current work comes out of. But in that sense, then, it is interesting, I think, always to build connection with Southeast Asia, and the issues were something I was tracking from a distance from some time on.
Right. And so what was it particularly about Myanmar that was drawing your interest and pulling you in?
I think a part of it is just the regionally, the human rights abuses by the military regime were quite visible. And at a certain point, it seemed like there was hope that things were changing. But then with the NLD taking office and etc. under Aung San Suu Kyi, but disappointing things occurred, such as the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. And so that was quite disappointing to watch in the 2010s, whereas there had been a lot of hope previously on Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD. That seemed to be quite disappointing, actually, to see this kind of turn. And so that was something I was also tracking from a distance. I remember encountering Burmese students in Taiwan, actually, and sometimes getting them into arguments with them about the Rohingyas. And so that was something that also occurred in the 2010s. I think that you do see a few less students from Burma after COVID, but that was something that occurred. And so it was something I was watching from a distance. But it was only until more recently, with Milk Tea Alliance work, that I have encountered more directly activists from Myanmar.
So you talk about being involved in the Sunflower Revolution, Occupy Wall Street, the anti-nuclear movement in Japan. So I guess a question to predate all of these different involvements of activities is what drove you towards activism and wanting to make a difference and being concerned in the first place? Because there'd be many people in your situation who would see these things happening around you and not really feel compelled or empowered to take a step. So what encouraged you to take that step?
It is a good question, and sometimes I'm not actually very sure. I think a lot of times it is just the people around me were very much part of these movements. But I think the experience of being between identities, between places, being connected to more than one place, it's very easy then for me to feel that the social causes of whatever place I'm in are something that I should advocate for. And I think being an outsider, seeing economic inequalities or social inequalities also contributed to that. In the US, when I was studying abroad in Japan or after going back to Taiwan, and I think wherever I am, I would be involved in some kind of local cause. And I think particularly for me, I was always surrounded by a lot of young people that were conscious about social issues, and so my friends were involved in this. And that is often my experience when I talk to student movements, whether in various countries in Southeast Asia. The students often talk about being drawn into movements just because all of their friends were there. And that was also very much my experience in all of these different contexts, actually.
Right. And do you remember the early stages of when, of some of the first stages of activism where you saw some injustice or something that wasn't right, and then something in you arose to want to try to respond to it, which then sent a wave of momentum that's continued to this day? Do you remember the early stages of that?
It's a good question, but I think even, let's say, on the streets of New York City, it's just so visible, the homelessness and the people that do need help, but then cannot receive it because society is quite unequal. And so I think in terms of that, a lot of my early activism was around fundraising or various forms of advocacy. For example, then in high school, we organized a pride parade, which was the first one in the area of New York that we were in. So these various demographics then that don't have the freedoms that we should all have. I think none of us are free until we all are. And so I think that was something that I was very conscious of that early on growing up.
So let's move to involvements you had in your home country of Taiwan. I understand you also spent years in the U.S. and you're half American as well. But looking at your where you are now in Taiwan, you talk about being involved in the Sunflower Revolution. This is, of course, an Insight Myanmar podcast, so our listeners may have varying degrees of understanding what the Sunflower Revolution was, as well as basic Taiwan politics. So tell us, give us a basic overview of what that was and how you were involved.
Yeah, and so I guess maybe we could rewind back to a bit about Taiwanese politics, in that Taiwan is a former authoritarian country. There are two political parties. One is the KMT, the former authoritarian party, which after democratization is still around. They realized that by becoming involved in the processes of democratization, it could actually survive if it did not get directly involved in facilitating this process and allowing for it, framing itself as a partner rather than enemy. It knew that it would be eliminated, and so it is still around. During the Sunflower Movement in 2014, that was a period in which the KMT had come back to power by winning an election, actually. And after winning an election, then it tried to turn back a lot of democratic reforms. For example, there was concern about the rising threat of China, but the KMT had pivoted in the years since the Chinese Civil War to become a more pro-China party. And that's a bit of a complicated story because the KMT, of course, fought a bloody civil war with the Chinese Communist Party, but now it is more in favor of political unification. There's a complex story there, but I think the interests of elites within both parties have come to coincide, particularly after the opening up of China and with Taiwan democratizing. And so after democracy, after we have democracy, many in the KMT, the elites have lost their privileges. But if you do facilitate unification between Taiwan and China, perhaps you can get those privileges back. And so there's that. And then in the context of 2014, the KMT is back to power. There is the buying up of media outlets by pro-China businessmen, and then censoring content that is critical of China in spite of the human rights abuses occurring there. And then there's the attempt then to ram through a trade deal with China that would allow for Chinese investment in the service sector industry, which is 65% of GDP. And so that would have an enormous political impact on Taiwan. And that's what led to this month-long occupation of the Taiwanese legislature that came to be known as the Sunflower Movement, which I was involved in when I was 22 or so and right out of college, but still hang out with a lot of college students. And so that's how I got pulled into the movement. It was mostly with the student group at National Yuming University. And then later on, we ended up forming this publication. It was quite a long movement, but then it was a very much a generational moment of awakening, I think, for Taiwanese young people about standing up for causes or feeling empowered to do so.
In what ways were you involved in the Sunflower Movement?
So it's interesting because I was just a foot soldier. Basically, when there was a charge such as occurred on the first night on March 18th, I charged the legislature with a bunch of other students.
Physically charging,
Yeah, and so we climbed over a gate into the parking lot of the legislature. I got there a bit later after the initial charge had happened, but then me and my friends were there, and then just that's how it all started. And other events, other forms of direct action or escalation, such as on March 23rd, the night of, there was an attempt to storm the executive branch of government. I was also part of that. And just being gathered in a kind of off-site location, secretive, cannot communicate like what you're doing, and just like, are you going to be part of this action or not? And assemble at this time, and then we all charged the executive branch of government, and things like that. And so I was just kind of variously around the movement, but it didn't really occur to me that I could act on the movement or try to influence things or build a platform until later on, after the end of the initial wave of the movement.
Right. Before getting to the platform that you built and what that did, just going back to that experience of physically charging. I mean, you're a university student. These are you're going into government buildings, which I assume have their own state security. Was there feelings of fear or excitement, or what were you actually feeling physically or of danger? What were you feeling physically as you were charging through these buildings?
So it was actually kind of interesting because compared to a lot of my friends who might have been younger or around the same age or older, I had a lot more experience of social movements because of Occupy Wall Street and the fact that I've been active in some sense since 15. And so by the time then, I was a little more used to it. But there's a sense of adrenaline, I think, from this kind of direct action. And I think there are some people in movements that are actually pursuing that sense of adrenaline, which is not necessarily the most productive. But then there's also fear because you don't know what to anticipate. You don't know what the rule book for the police is, to what level they may escalate. And so the night of March 23rd is remembered as perhaps being the largest use of police force since the end of martial law, with firing of water cannons and police coming with batons and things of that sort. But at the time, it was just a lot of confusion and just a lot of adrenaline. And I think a lot of it is that we were quite young. And so there's a lot of kind of passions that go into things. People really sometimes become very sucked into the movement in a way that it is being useful in that sense.
Did that physical charge feel like something coordinated and organized and following a certain protocol, or was there any degree of mob mentality or the excitement of being caught up in something that then came and morphed it as it went along?
So the interesting thing is that the Sunfire Movement and all of the direct actions that took place, whether the charge into the legislature, the charge of the executive branch of government, they were all premeditated actions. And often the framing from the protesters would be to act as though these were spontaneous actions, because the public at large romanticizes spontaneity. But for example, the charge in the legislature was deliberate, and people didn't expect to actually get in, but then people got in. And so what do you do now? We just maintain an occupation. But how long will it go? And so a week passed, and the desire was to escalate because it was not seen as the public responding to the demands of the government responding. So that led to the attempt to charge the executive branch, the executive branch of government. And then, even though that occurred, the people in the legislature, even though they knew about this occurring, pretended as though they did not, and it was a different group. But it was premeditated. And there were three different groups: the front door, back door, and side door. I was part of the back door group. The front door and the side door group got in. The back door group did not, and we ended up getting surrounded by police and kettled. And what happened was a group of our friends were surrounded by police, and then we were surrounding the police in turn. So we lay down on the ground, so they have to step on us if they want to get out. But then a crowd assembled behind us. And so eventually, after a standoff of several hours, the police let us out because they could not get out safely without the crowd just kind of intervening. And so we all got out then, and we went back around to the front to see, what was going on, because they got in, and it looked like a war zone in some sense. People had spilled in, it was very chaotic, etc. But it's a lot of different things. It was definitely a planned action, but I think a lot of people didn't have experience. And so the little incidents that occur within this action, too, have sometimes become magnified within the activist circles, because there's still this kind of portioning out of blame about why that went wrong or could have been better. And that often happens in social movements. I see that all over.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk, because you're quite young, and yet you have quite an institutional history that you're already willing to learn and to draw from. But then you talk about, after this physical action of being, in your words, a foot soldier, you then realize that you could move to another level of activism and advocacy and have your own platform. So tell us how that came about and what that platform is.
Yeah, so we ended up founding New Bloom magazine. And so we launched in July 2014. And so it's right about 10 years now. And we celebrated our 10-year anniversary like 2 weeks ago.
Great.
And so after the movement, we just talked about what we could do after, because I see this too with the movement in Myanmar and elsewhere. After this massive spontaneous energy from a movement, you think about how to keep it going long term, how to make it sustainable. And often it ends up being creating structure, creating new organizations or networks or platforms, etc. And so there's a wave of new organizations that emerged, student networks, student unions. And for us then, we wanted to make a publication. There was also a wave of publications that came out of the movement, and one of them was us. Part of it was because a lot of people in our group of friends were more bilingual. And so there's a reading group. We often met to read political texts, political literature, philosophy, those kind of texts. And a lot of the reading is in English because it has never been translated into Chinese. And so when the movement happened, a lot of people got involved in the outreach efforts, translating things into English, trying to connect with the international world to make sure people are aware of this expression of how young people feel Taiwan's relation with China or Taiwan's democratic politics should be. And so that ended up being the position we played. And so how to continue that, it seemed like forming a publication was a natural step. And so then we got our friends together, just tried to get people involved to write. I had some experience on student newspapers, and some other people did as well. And so that helped with building a website or editorial content. And that ended up becoming New Bloom Magazine, which still runs now 10 years later. And we also run a physical space in Taipei to do events. And so it has changed a lot, but I think a lot of it was just that the role that people with this ability to communicate could play. And that ended up, I think, determining what kind of platform we decided to make.
And what is this what is this platform allowing and empowering you to do now as you follow and engage with the ebb and flow of Taiwanese politics and social movements that you couldn't do before when this was happening 10 years ago, when you were trying to be involved, but you didn't have a platform like this? How is this increasing your staying power and impact?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that the world did not really care about Taiwanese voices or what young Taiwanese people felt about their future. Taiwan's often talked about as an object, as though it's America that determines the future of Taiwan. And I think that's an issue with many countries in the region, actually. And then the international attention on any country that's out of the Western context is quite fickle. So it'll very quickly be distracted by the latest news spectacle. And so I think it was building a platform to really counter that, to have more in-depth reporting on Taiwan that's more ground level from local perspectives. That's also more detailed, rather than having to always explain these basics about the Chinese Civil War and that Taiwan's a renegade province and things like that. And so even seeing actually with Myanmar, just the reporting, there's always the same few lines that you see in every major outlet. And so we have this issue, I think. And so I think it's that's the reason why we decided to do that and to try to really kind of counter that and to have a platform and build it up over time so that people could see these viewpoints.
It's really interesting because before I had this podcast, I felt that whenever there was a development about Myanmar in the world, I would have to read 75% of an article, which told me everything I already knew, to try to get 2 or 3 lines of something new, because Myanmar was so off the spectrum of what was known that we had to remember what happened 15 years ago and 10 years ago and who this person was, and then you'd find 1 or 2 little nuggets in there. And when I started doing this platform, sometimes we would have authors or democratic leaders or different people on, and I would tell them, look, I know in the other interviews you have to explain where Myanmar is on the map and what their history is from, I don't know, 48 or 62 or 88 or whatever it is. You don't have to do that here. People know those dates. You can just get right into the meat of what whatever your background or your actions or your work is, and we'll have an audience ready to follow along. You know, people's reactions will just be like, wow, that's so great. They're so tired of having to explain Myanmar history 101 and just be able to get, directly into what their particular perspective or work is. So that definitely resonates.
Yeah, absolutely. I do a lot of the media appearances after a while. Eventually, after people knew this platform, then I started appearing on radio and television, and it's always saying the same thing. And I feel a bit like ChatGPT, and just explaining, just like the how to digest Taiwan's complicated 70-year history into just like a few sentences, and then try to get to the actual developing story. And then it is, as you say, just these major outlets when they report on Taiwan. Most of everything has just already been reported. It's common sense, and nobody really needs to know this. But they might have like a paragraph or two that's something new that you didn't know. Right. And so that's something that is the actual news development that they are reporting on. So it's very frustrating. I think that particularly building a platform, we wanted to do something to get around that because there was a need for that. And it's very different now, actually, 10 years later, because there is such focus on Taiwan after the Pelosi visit and the Chinese military drills and TSMC and Taiwanese semiconductors being world known, things like that. And so it's very different compared to 10 years ago when there's very much obscurity regarding Taiwan.
So I definitely want to get personally into your involvement with Milk Tea Alliance. But before that, I think this is a really great segue to get into the, perhaps in some listeners' mind, unlikely association, history, and current connection between Taiwan and Burma. This is a really interesting point of examination. And let's start with the history, because really we can, as we were talking before this interview, we can trace the interesting history between Burma and Taiwan at least until the 1950s. If not before that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is after the Chinese Civil War, because though there are probably connections before, a lot of it, the modern history really goes back to that. I mean, there were KMT troops in the war against the CCP that ended up in Burma, and we have a long history there that I won't go into as much. But there were some people that came over to Taiwan after that, and so, for example, even one of the members of my organization is half Burmese Chinese, or Chinese Burmese, and half Taiwanese. And so there are people that migrated. There's a neighborhood in Taiwan that's often referred to as Little Burma. That's actually where my family is from, my dad's side, because my dad is actually Chinese Indonesian, but immigrated to Taiwan, and so he ended up in a place with a lot of other migrants from Southeast Asia. And during the coup, for example, there was a lot of demonstrations there because the communities there, the exile communities or diaspora communities, were NLD supported primarily. And so there's a connection there. But I think what's interesting is that contemporary Taiwan, it doesn't come up as much because in the past there would be this emphasis on the KMT and the history and the glory of it. But then there are all these troops that were just abandoned and they end up having afterlives that then the current government of Taiwan, if it's under the KMT still, they don't really want to deal with that because it doesn't reflect well on them. And if it's the DPP, which historically came out of the pro-democracy movement, they're not as interested in that history because for them it's the history of authoritarianism and this party that came to Taiwan and then imposed authoritarian law on the people that were there already, which is 90% of the population. And so building those connections are more in a democratic, I think, way or among youth movements, something I'm much more interested in. But there's actually a very rich history there, and I think people go into that more. There's a history of migration from Southeast Asia, and you do see migrants. I mentioned seeing students from Myanmar in the past. I think, again, after the coup and after COVID in particular, you see far less of that. But then that's another connection, and I think that it would be quite valuable. And I think this history is something that people are trying to mine out now, and kind of there's some very interesting documentaries being produced and some very interesting academic research going to Southeast Asia and trying to find these connections with these communities. Something between minority groups, for example, such as Hakka in Southeast Asia. And so it's quite interesting history there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the first time this really came on my radar as being something that was a field of interest to think about was I was in some bookshop in Yangon. You find all these random books you can't find anywhere else, and I found some book that was from some Taiwanese publication society. That I don't know when it was from, the 70s or the 80s, and it was a reflection of Taiwanese former KMT in Taiwan who were reflecting about their battlefield trauma and comrades that were lost or that had never made it out of either because they died or they stayed on in Burma. And it was showing this migration from China to Burma and then settling in Taiwan, and Burma being this kind of this special but traumatic memory of something they couldn't quite let go of. And that was the first thing that put on my radar. And of course, in World War II, you hear this with people from all different backgrounds and regiments and countries. But that was my first inkling of like, oh, this is some connection there that I wasn't aware of before this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite interesting. I mean, there are a lot of people that spent most of their lives in that sense, actually, in Burma, and then may have ended up in Taiwan later on in life. And for them, Burma was actually the place traumatic, but they spent literally most of their decades there. And that experience, I think, of wartime is, then very at the core of, I think, their identity in that sense. Yeah, it plays itself out in different ways. But I think particularly Taiwan often has not grappled with the history of the Chinese Civil War and the different afterlives and all across Southeast Asia, in Taiwan itself. And this is another part of this large history that has yet to be unpacked.
And I just want to flesh that out also for our listeners, because not only is this significant, obviously, for the formation of modern Taiwan, but also for the history, the traumatic history of Burma itself, because the Chinese Civil War was one of the great destabilizing factors of many that were already endemic in Burma, but specifically the Chinese involvement in the Civil War at that time, the American CIA covert ops that were taking place in supporting the KMT, and the eventual how difficult it made it for UNU's government to during the parliamentary democracy period. It was one of the factors that led to Ne Win's coup and making and further destabilizing everything. And we had Kenton Clymer on the podcast some time ago, who is an academic who studied U.S.-Burma relations, and he has entire chapters on what happened during this period and how the tense negotiations that were occurring between the U.S. and China and Burma and some of the other actors there to try to evacuate the KMT, but then to pretend that you were evacuating some, but there were some still left. And then, of course, you inferred this, but to flesh it out even further, the KMT who stayed largely turned into what we see as the drug trade and the Golden Triangle that remained. And so the legacy of these KMT troops, these nationalist troops that ended up on the losing end of fighting the Civil War against the communists in China, what became of them, both in terms of, well, not both, because you have so many factors, of destabilizing the country, of leading to the drug trade and some of the armed conflict that happened in that region, and then the formation of modern Taiwan. I mean, this is definitely a history that hasn't really been unpacked and discovered as extensively as it should be.
Absolutely. I mean, just the KMT involvement in the drug trade, it went back to its presence in China. I mean, basically all the forces involved were involved in the drug trade to some extent. KMT, CCP, Even though they publicly were against opium, they still engaged in some trade, kind of in that sense. And then the U.S. would sometimes turn a blind eye to that. And so particularly Taiwan is another country in which a right-wing authoritarian actor was backed for so long by the U.S., which is Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Ching-kuo.
Right.
And in terms of that larger geopolitical design, I mean, Taiwan, Myanmar, it's all kind of part of the U.S. in that larger, what was seen during the Cold War as the struggle against communism and propping up these various forces. But then oftentimes the decision making would be very unstrategic or change suddenly, or the lack of understanding of local context. And so I think in that sense, both Burma and Taiwan have seen a lot of twists and turns in terms of that history.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's because so much of that was covert. That's when you mentioned the U.S. would then turn suddenly in a different direction. What they did before that turn is still something not really known today. And so the history of some of these countries, particularly Burma, which is what I know more, is the role and the decisions that the U.S. played at different points in time because of geopolitical reasons. And of course, you can go to Britain before that in the colonial period. So much of that has led to the problems that have developed since, really laid the groundwork, but they now have kind of a ghostly quality of disappearing, where we forget to attribute some of the problems today with the decisions and actions made there by some of the Western powers before.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of the ethnic issues currently go back to British colonialism and the kind of divisions that were propped up then. Yeah.
So again, before we move to your involvement with Milk Tea Alliance, just staying on looking more from the geopolitical sense in Burma, China, Taiwan, we talked about that history of KMT and how the role that played in Taiwan over the years. But let's look at the relation between Burma and Taiwan in the ensuing decades, because of course the question of who is recognizing Taiwan and and having relations is an important one. And so through the years of the dictatorship, the NLD being in charge, and then the current formation of the NUG, even we can say the military, what connections, if any, have these different governments or leaders had with Taiwan and recognizing Taiwan?
So ironically, Taiwan wants to build stronger economic ties with Southeast Asia to counterbalance China. But then when it comes to that, there are a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia are military juntas, and at the backing of those military juntas, sometimes it's China. I mean, not direct ties of, let's say, authority, but economic and technology transfers, those kinds of things. And so then it is, for Taiwan, is trying to carve out space in Southeast Asia, but it puts itself in an awkward position in that sense. So in the past, there were more migrant workers from Myanmar, actually, but that has not occurred as often in the past few decades. Right now, Taiwan currently have 4 major countries, which is Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. And so because of that, there's not as much kind of overt discussion of what goes on. There's actually some movements in the Taiwanese parliament, contemporary parliament, regarding supporting Myanmar. So there are marking of the coup anniversary by civil society groups that go and try to do things with legislators and so forth. But it doesn't really come up that often, particularly in the last decade. And so I think it's quite unfortunate, because I think there could be much more attention to the movements there and what's occurring or trying to build ties. And so it does come up once in a while, but I think particularly Taiwan ends up becoming one of these places where, because there's sometimes not a lot of attention paid to what occurs there, it can be a way station for funneling goods and technology repairs and that kind of thing, similar to the role Singapore plays. And so civil society groups in Taiwan have sometimes been quite critical. So I think it's a challenge, but I think then, particularly Taiwan in terms of diplomatic relations, the allies that Taiwan currently has are mostly countries that have very poor human rights records. They're all smaller than Taiwan. And so actually Myanmar has a larger population by like 2 or 3 times. So it's much larger, and so it hasn't really fit into that. But Taiwan's unofficial relations are often much more important. And in terms of diplomatic relations, it often now, in the past decade particularly, follows what the U.S. does. And so I think particularly stances on Myanmar would have to probably follow the U.S. And the current administration has not really talked about that. I mean, there's discussion of, let's say, the Burma Act in D.C., but then it doesn't really come up as often in Taiwan, even though there's similar desire to have proposals from the U.S. legislature that are backing Taiwan. And so it's quite interesting to watch, but it doesn't really come up in political discourse as much.
And has the NUG come out to make any statement on Taiwan?
So there's been some controversy regarding that, because the NUG did once refer to One China principle.
Yeah,
so this is another complicated thing regarding One China policy, which is the U.S., and One China principle, which is China. But then China conflates the two deliberately to try to really get people caught up in recognizing its policy. And so it was actually a bit surprising that people from the NUG admitted to One China principle rather than policy. And that seemed to be a strategic misstep, which maybe they themselves we're not always so conscious of the differences. I looked into it a bit in that sense. And so it's interesting because Taiwan is a very key interest for the CCP. But in terms of the NUG, for example, negotiating with China, it might have made a bit more sense to actually hold on to that card and play it more strategically. And so that was a bit puzzling. But I think, surprisingly, in Taiwan, there's not a lot of strong reactions to that. Taiwan often, despite the fact that it is a former authoritarian country and the current government came out of a democracy movement, does not pay very much attention to what occurs on other parts of the world in terms of similar places with similar contemporary times to Taiwan's own history.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's a blindness to it. I think just Taiwan is very much focused on the U.S. because of the U.S. backing Taiwan, and so there's only attention paid to U.S. domestic politics. But even then, it's very much flattened into, for example, just the one-dimensional metric of does this politician support Taiwan or do they not support Taiwan? And so that is actually, I think, something I see with other countries too that have substantial ties with the U.S. or China. It's very much flattened out in terms of a very simplistic understanding of the context of these places.
As you're saying that, I'm just contrasting Taiwan with Czech Republic, and Czech Republic famously came out of authoritarian rule, and Havel was famous for wanting to look at the freedom that his country had gained and try to share that freedom with those who are not yet free. And so because of that, there are, just as we talk about the perhaps surprising or unknown connection between Burma and Thailand or Burma and Taiwan to a lay audience.
Yeah.
So also there's a decades long history of somewhat surprising close connections between Czech and Burma, and particularly Havel and Aung San Suu Kyi, of Havel choosing Burma as one of several countries he really wanted to use his own liberation to help others to achieve that as well. And so it's even though Czech and Taiwan are such different countries in every aspect of how you would look at their histories and geography and such, it is interesting to contrast in that when you said that, it immediately brought to mind the role that Czech has played in wanting to support today and in previous decades the Burmese democracy movement as it can.
Yeah, so it's interesting because Taiwan often does have ties with the Czech Republic or Eastern Europe, countries that went through this history during the Cold War. But then I think particularly Taiwan has not always had the desire to reach out to other countries regarding democracy. I think a lot of that goes back to, again, I mentioned the issue of China, that the attempt is to wean yourself off of economic dependency on China and build stronger ties with Southeast Asian countries, but then the governments of these countries are often authoritarian. And so that leads to these issues then in which the Taiwanese government will not talk so loudly about democracy because of this desire to have economic ties. And so I find that quite unfortunate. I think that human rights can have a much stronger role to play in diplomacy for Taiwan. Some legislators are interested in that, but then it often ends up being causes that Taiwan is more familiar with, such as Tibet or Xinjiang. And so then, for example, Myanmar does come up sometimes, but not enough. I did allude to that there are a number of, Burmese migrants in Taiwan, but they're not large enough as a voting bloc to influence politics in that sense.
And you did talk about how there was some civil society activity in Taiwan that was in solidarity with the developments in Burma. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting because this took place at a time in which basically there was all of these different rallies being occurring in Taipei in particular, regarding Hong Kong, regarding Thailand, regarding Myanmar. And so as these events were happening, the students in Taiwan would then start organizing and doing events. And that is the similar pattern in that sense. And that took place around the time in which the notion of the Milk Tea Alliance came together because of the fact that there's all this online activism. Young people are connecting because of this ability to have a shared discourse online and social media. And that was also around when COVID happened. And so when that occurred, Taiwan, which was able to avoid COVID for over a year because the borders were closed, then there actually was still these kind of real world solidarity events happening. And so new organizations came out of that. In terms of there's a neighborhood, as I mentioned, called Little Burma, which is where there are a lot of Burmese migrants. And for the first time, I think Taiwanese society realized how large that neighborhood is. There were rallies of tens of thousands of people.
Wow.
And I'm actually not sure this is registered regionally as well, because that is quite a large diaspora.
Yeah.
But I think because there are compositions that they're mostly ethnically Chinese, and so they are NLD supporters mostly. And so I think that's kind of, there's not been a lot of attention on that kind of diaspora there, but it is quite interesting to watch. And so that was a time of substantial mobilizations, but Hong Kong and Myanmar were among the largest in Taiwan. Hong Kong, because there are Hong Kong migrants and there's a shared language and historical connection, but also then this diaspora was quite large and could mobilize. So new organizations came out of that, but then some have not really lasted. I think there's a peak of energy, and so I'm not really sure as much what's happening now.
Yeah. So it's quite interesting because you've gone into exploring these age-old connections between Taiwan and Burma, and that have really impacted the futures of both countries going forward, as well as your involvement as a student activist in Taiwan and really everywhere you've been. This leads into looking at how all of this came together, how all of this coalesced into what is now known as milk tea. And you reference how you yourself were interested in Myanmar from an early stage, just the egregious violation of human rights, leading to a kind of cautious optimism going into the transition period. And so where did this all come together?
So it's interesting because I think a lot of it is because New Bloom, at the publication I helped found, was very much from the start a very social media driven phenomenon, because it's young people starting a new publication. It's not going to be print because there's no way to afford that. It's being online, but then online spaces, other people start reading to in English. It's one of the few English language kind of progressive news sources on Taiwan. It is the largest English language independent media.
Okay.
And which is basically, we're the only independent media in English. And so then what happened is that we built these connections and it kind of came together online, and Milk Tea Alliance happened, and then I'll get invited to events to talk about it and things like that, and being pulled more into these different networks. And it's interesting too, because in the beginning I was very skeptical of this phenomenon, because I think particularly around Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, there's such enthusiasm around social media that in a way I didn't think was always justified, because it was a way to organize for sure, but people organized before the rise of social media in massive numbers. And I don't think that replaces the kind of on-the-ground activism either, where you do have to go and talk to people rather than just online interactions. But then when it came to the Milk Tea Alliance, there was a lot of creativity online. And in terms of artwork, in terms of means being produced, there's a very self-referential but humorous kind of element to it. And what's also interesting to me is that it's very much a phenomenon of the present. It's very much a phenomenon of globalization. Even the name Milk Tea, taking the name from that each country in the Milk Tea Alliance has a milk tea beverage, signifies that you're aware of the other country through food, for example, because either that you've traveled there or there are restaurants in that country in your home country. And the way it came together through online memes from a Thai BL drama, and then all these other memes from Japanese anime or Hollywood, that reflects this kind of shared discourse that young people in the region or worldwide have. And it's kind of the ability to come up with a shared sense of humor around that, and then to steer that into political directions. And we see that with other phenomena as well. For example, K-pop stans can be very political, and that's another online phenomenon. And that came together in the Milk Tea Alliance. And then eventually, kind of in these online spaces, I encountered names I'd heard before, because there was this series of movements that occurred in the early 2010s, which are often occupation-style movements, whether in Taiwan or Japan or Hong Kong with the Umbrella Movement or elsewhere. And then there would always be the groups that came out of each of these movements that was interested in building transnational solidarity. And so for Taiwan, our group was that group.
I see.
But then there were other groups and other individuals that are very much interested in this. And there were attempts in the early 2010s to come together and form these kind of transnational alliances, and eventually they lost steam by the mid-2010s. But then in the late 2010s, with the rise of the Milk Tea Alliance, I would see the same names again. And so then it's like these people. And so sometimes I would finally meet somebody through this framework of the Milk Tea Alliance that perhaps in a different world, or if things had gone differently, or if there had not been COVID, I would have met maybe closer to early 2010s. But then in that sense, we started working together and doing things and coordinating campaigns and things like that, and often takes place at a distance. But I think COVID in particular has been an accelerator for the ability to coordinate campaigns online, because everyone was doing everything online. And so that's been another phenomenon.
Great. So that leaves us where we are with Milk Tea now, through this rather amorphous journey of people coming together and finding connection. Where would you say, how would you say that Myanmar has influenced Milk Tea, or the role that Myanmar plays in this?
Yeah, I think Myanmar is a very strong focal point, because it is the outlier in some sense. So the Milk Tea Alliance, the original three countries were Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Thailand. And if it had only been Taiwan and Hong Kong, nobody would have blinked, because Taiwan and Hong Kong, there's the shared threat of China, there's the shared language, or ability to read each other's language, so maybe not communicate speaking, and it's East Asia, that Northeast Asia in that sense. And then for Thailand, it's the new addition, it's Southeast Asia. And so that's actually what made it unique in terms of Milk Tea Alliance. But then Myanmar also, joining the Milk Tea Alliance, reflects the permeability of this framework, that basically when there's a struggle, you can also be part of the Milk Tea Alliance. It's not exclusionary, but it is the one in which there was not just peaceful protests or student movements in forms of civil disobedience, but one that spilled over into a civil war. And I think that is the difference. But I think that though there's a very strong difference in that sense. The protest tactics that work in the other places, for example, will not work in Myanmar because it is more oppressive and it is a civil war, so different circumstances. But then a lot of other experiences are similar. For example, the experience of exile with Hong Kong and Myanmar currently, that is very similar. And so I think there are particularly ways that we can all learn from each other, actually.
So when you talk about Myanmar joining, what does that mean? Myanmar joined? Was there a particular group or activists that came to the fore? How was it that Myanmar became involved in those moments?
Not really people getting involved because Milk Tea Alliance is very decentralized and there's no formal organization. But then voices from Myanmar would emerge and were interested in this or this kind of framework online. And so there was that, and there was a desire from other Milk Tea Alliance groups that had already formed to kind of look at Myanmar then, or to build more ties there because of seeing what's going on. And so I think it really is the ethos of the Milk Tea Alliance in some sense, is this shared sense of solidarity and this desire that, or this view that whatever happens in the region, we all have a stake in this. And so I think that's what led to this desire to really outreach. And I think it did help having friends from Myanmar that you knew from before. And so they're in the struggle when things happen there. And so you also feel a sense of investment because they are your friends. And so I think a lot of the construction of solidarity is based on friendship in that sense. And so knowing people from a place is what gets you invested in it. I mean, I mentioned that from high school I knew what was happening in Myanmar back then, but you don't really have a personal stake until you actually know somebody from there.
Right. And so now, over 3 years after the coup has taken place, still not successful, unlikely, hopefully, to ever be successful, but resistance continuing and the country really going through struggles. What is the role that Myanmar now is playing in the Milk Tea alliances and discussions and frameworks? Because it is, even though there are similarities across these countries of the type of struggle and the type of authoritarianism that they're fighting, there really is an extreme going on in Myanmar that still does make it something of an outlier. So how is that being seen in the contemporary discussions of Milk Tea?
There's also another reason why Myanmar is an outlier. It's because Milk Tea is a very internet-driven phenomenon, but there are such internet outages in Myanmar, and so it's very actually difficult. So I think particularly there's a desire now to have more Myanmar voices. I mean, I mentioned all this desire to, from my work, for example, to try to get Taiwanese voices out there, and I think we all feel that about our own countries. But then in this struggle, I mean, obviously it should be Myanmar voices. But then that becomes more difficult because of the lack of internet access, the repressive conditions, and so that's a challenge. And so oftentimes then we end up working with people that are in exile, and that then trying to build something to kind of have shared campaigns. The fact that so many people are here now in Thailand is actually, that helps a lot because, I mean, I think then you can have more direct connection with someone that you can actually meet. But then I think that's a challenge, actually, how to connect these different places, but then really how to elevate Myanmar voices. And I think particularly ASEAN is a target of a lot of campaigns because ASEAN is supposed to be this regional framework that is for our benefit, but then does not actually do things and is often very quiet and is reluctant to take stands on human rights abuses in any of these countries, really. And so trying to call that to account is another kind of thrust of the Milk Tea Alliance, I think, efforts currently. I mean, there's no organizations, there's no specific policy or campaign. There's just a number of various spontaneous campaigns that are decentralized. There are various attempts at coordinating as well between different groups, which can also be challenging. And that occurs within Myanmar as well, because when you have a exile diaspora, often then you see fragmentation and fights and infighting. And so also navigating around that is another challenge. But that's true actually of all of these contexts. I mean, Hong Kong sees similar struggles. And so how to share our experiences and learn from each other is something we, I think, attempt.
And so where do you see Milk Tea going forward? If you've had a part of Milk Tea is such an emphasis on decentralization and democratization and not wanting to have a central leadership or organization, and yet there are disadvantages and things you give up by being able to have the more spontaneous collective decision-making type of action going forward that maybe you lose in terms of the focus and the central decision-making that can happen, but then you take empowerment and authority away from people with their own ideas and creativity, and you just repeat the same structures that have existed before.
Yeah, I think the identity of Milk Tea is very much caught up with being decentralized and having no leader. Particularly that's an evolution, because from the movements of the early 2010s to the late 2010s, is the early 2010s are much more leader figures, the Joshua Longs, the Nedowitz, etc. And what happened is they get targeted and as part of efforts to decapitate movements. Once they don't have a leader, they are more directionless. And so the adaptation is to have leaderless movements that are decentralized. You have planning that's coordination attempts, but then it's very much not based on individuals. And that's very much the core of Milk Tea Alliance. But I think that, again, as I mentioned, after movements, there's a lot of spontaneity. And you try to put that into the structure to keep it going. And that's maybe also the attempt. The other thing is that the Milk Tea Alliance is fading as a hashtag. There's research done by Austin Wong, who's a Taiwanese professor of political science, and tracking the amount of mentions of Milk Tea Alliance on the internet, there's been a very dramatic drop. And so is it still relevant? That I think for us it's still relevant, but it's also true, I think, that we'd be the people trying to organize transnational solidarity regardless. And I think then thinking out ways to keep this going, because movements have ebbs and flows, highs and lows, and we're going through another kind of phase of contraction. And so how do we get ahead of the curve and think of ways to make it more sustainable? That's the question. And so it might involve some kind of structure that is still able to maintain a decentralized ethos, or to keep managing the current level of activity in a kind of pattern, a holding pattern, until something else comes along that allows for another kind of flaring up of protester capacity to do things. And so that's another question.
One thing we've heard a lot from people outside of Myanmar who have been in Milk Tea or supporting in some form, what's been happening in Myanmar, is that this sense of a reciprocal relationship, that what we're doing for them now, we hope that they're then going to be there for us when we go through our struggles, and we have similar struggles we're also working out. And one of the things we saw soon after the coup was that I heard of at the time was that a lot of the Burmese protesters and the organizers were using advice and guidance from Hong Kong especially, and Taiwan or Thailand as well, in those early days of the protests. And there were actually like manuals being translated, and people overseas that had been there, done that were giving them advice. When that happened at the time, to be honest, I didn't know so much how to make sense of it, because I wasn't following those regional movements as much. I was really just in Myanmar and knowing that more. As the time has gone on, the scope has come out, I've been much more interested in seeing these transnational relationships and these connections and associations that can happen.
I mean, I think the Milk Tea Alliance, a lot of the ethos is to pay it forward, because everyone's going to go through something eventually, and so you try to be there for other people in hopes they will be there for you when something occurs. In that sense, I think there's also a lot of capacity to learn, because we all share similar challenges, but more practically or pragmatically, we share similar policing techniques from states, because often they're using the same technology. We learn from each other, so do authoritarian states. And so you do have different manuals. I mean, Hong Kong, during the protests, there was a lot of crowdsourced manuals of what gear is useful. The safety helmets, the goggles, the masks, what model helps for what circumstance, how many blows can this helmet take from a police baton before it breaks, those kind of things. And because then that kind of knowledge is very useful for another context, if you can get the same stuff. But also, for example, the way that tear gas canisters were put out with safety cones, and that in Hong Kong was filmed and memed, and manuals are made, and that ends up elsewhere in Thailand or Myanmar, etc. And the iconic clothing from Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters of black, and the kind of gear that people wear, you see that in other places now, and I think that's much more common, because that's just the way you deal with things. And then I hear stories of people knowing how to put out tear gas and things like that, and just villages doing that and things like that. And the internet has really been very powerful for that. And so you do have this attempt to create connections. A lot of that, these manuals are just kind of produced spontaneously online from random individuals. But then I think also there's a lot of internet artwork that gets created, and I think that's also very interesting to watch. The Three Finger Salute, for example, has spread from place to place to place, and it came from the Hunger Games originally. And so that's another way in which this meme from a kind of popular culture thing that we all know regionally became present in each context. But I think it's another kind of, it's very sequential in that sense, because Hong Kong drew so much attention at the time that other countries seem to learn from Hong Kong. And I think correspondingly, it's not as much that Hong Kong protesters look to Myanmar as perhaps the other way around. And so that points to some of the unevenness within the Milk Tea Alliance. Hong Kong is the kind of focal point, and then other countries try to learn from this experience. And I think that a lot of it's because there's so much media spectacle there. And I think it's interesting too, because particularly Hong Kong ties to China, and that ties to the Western world's geopolitical interests. And Myanmar has not received as much attention sometimes because of, contrary to that, there's not as much geopolitical interest there. And I think particularly Hong Kong, there's a lot of Western media that are present in Hong Kong. That's why all these images could flow out from Hong Kong. But Myanmar, though there's a civil war, and though there's as much airstrikes as in Ukraine, you don't have as much images and spectacle coming out. And so it is true, I think there's also some shortcomings of this kind of online phenomenon in terms of what places it pays attention to.
Right. One of the other hopes and aspirations of Milk Tea is obviously to influence society, to have an impact in trying to create the types of societies and freedoms and governments and leadership structures that you would like to see going forward, to advocate for that in any number of ways, whether it's media or politics, running for office, or social initiatives, campaigns, freedoms, changes in law, whatever it is. Looking at the wider milk tea phenomenon and movement over these past number of years, are there real successes you can point to that you can attribute to milk tea's influence in whatever country you want to point to?
It's actually a good question. I actually think not really, because I think a lot of these phenomena, it's hard to point to as like concrete influence. I do see these memes, and I do think these images and manuals and things like that circulating, but having a concrete influence for anything is very difficult, I think, for social movements. And I think it's very hard to point to that. And I think that maybe that's the point, is to not look at that concrete example, but the shared kind of ethos or discourse, or the desire for young people from different countries to kind of stand in solidarity with each other. In that sense, also, I think maybe it's good that there's not this attention to what does occur, because it is an online phenomenon. It's anonymized in an age in which it's, as I mentioned, we don't really have leader protests now. We have leaderless protests because things are more dangerous. Everything is anonymized. And so I have a kind of danger or fear of the Milk Tea Alliance becoming this kind of conspiratorial thing where people point to that as though it's like the Illuminati orchestrating everything, similar to like all these conspiracy theories about the NED or the CIA and so forth. So there's also that. But then I think in the meantime, it is a network that exists, and I think it is helpful.
Right. You bring up the question of danger and safety. And so just as these dictatorial regimes and authoritarian leadership structures are conspiring and talking to each other to learn the latest in how you control your population, so also these transnational movements of activists and advocates are coming together to learn from each other and see what they can do to be able to influence the kind of change they want. But I'm sure that those more authoritarian regimes are not too happy about their own nationals talking to each other more and more and connecting more and more. And so are there wider safety considerations to be considered when, in terms of the sharing at the top levels going on, of how you guys are meeting each other, coordinating, having campaigns physically at times, going to physical places to meet and to talk in person? Are there real safety precautions that have to be made about those governments coordinating to prevent you on the ground from having those connections?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's always that concern, but then the need is to stay under the table and kind of keep it out of under the radar of the governments, I think. But it's a question, and so it's interesting because it is a form of activism that's very much based on anonymity, whereas in another context, or maybe even 10 years ago, it'd be about trying to raise your profile and much more about individuals in that sense. And so I think a lot of that it's a challenge. I mean, there's some places where you can still have meetings and that kind of thing. I mean, Taiwan is still safe, and so you can still go there. But then what happens is the visas are much more challenging from activists from Southeast Asia. And so you always have these kind of compromises that you have to kind of make. And so it is difficult. But I think it's a form of activism that's about reducing profile in a way while drawing attention to a specific cause. And so I think that's the ethos currently.
And where do you see the focus on Myanmar going forward from the milk tea standpoint?
It's a good question, because I think particularly these online phenomenon, or even this kind of anti-authoritarian ethos, it's often protesting against state actors. But then in this case, with Myanmar, you do also have to appeal to other state actors to try to provide aid or etc. Or to pressure other governments to condemn the actions of the junta. And so I think it's a good question. It's also a challenge, as I mentioned, because connecting with activists on the ground is much more difficult right now compared to the other contexts of Milk Tea Alliance, in which there were protest movements happening, but you still had the ability to access people online. And so it is a question. So I think a lot of the question is, how do you conduct this advocacy from outside, but also which hopefully does center Myanmar voices, and yet it is so difficult to do so at present. And so I think that's still the things we're working on present. I think it's kind of unresolved, but we've been trying to get around that, I think, for several years at this point, because this has not really changed in the course of the past few years, trying to center Myanmar voices, but then it's very hard getting people to be able to put energy into this or have the capacity that you can access them, those kind of things.
Right. So with that in mind, I think we've covered a great gamut at warp speed of this very interesting Taiwan-Burma history and milk tea, and where you found yourself in the nexus of all of this. I really appreciate this discussion and the sharing that you've done to help us understand this. And thank you for your time and coming on here.
Well, I mean, I hope that we can continue to act in solidarity and continue to coordinate. So still trying to work on that, I guess. So I guess I'll leave it there. Thanks for having me.
the most tragic aspects of the current crisis in Myanmar is how isolated Burmese protesters feel, and in fact are. Thankfully, through our nonprofit organization Better Burma, we are able to ensure that all donations successfully reach their intended target. So if you found yourself moved by today's discussion and want to do what you can to help, please consider giving to our fund, which is 100% directed towards supporting the movement. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam